Hello, this is Federico Foders with another lecture of International Trade, ECO735 in the second semester. This is the fifth week and we will deal with imperfect competition. As you know, we have been discussing the most important models in international trade theory that aim at explaining the direction and the composition of international trade under the assumption that we're moving under perfect competition, which means that there are no profits and most of the firms are price takers. This, however, is not what we meet in the real world. Yes? So when we start to analyze what is happening in countries on the African continent or in Asia or in Latin America or in Europe or in the US or wherever, you will find that perfect competition is not the characteristic market structure. Rather, imperfect competition is what we met in practice. What we're going to do is to take a look at trade under imperfect competition, market structure, and the gains of trade. Do they change if the market structure changes? What is different under imperfect competition from what we have learned under perfect competition? Also, we will have a look at trade policy under imperfect competition and see how tariff and taxes change the welfare and resource allocation consequences. Then we will have some conclusions and scope for further research. Trade and trade policy under imperfect competition. The market structures that you find under imperfect competition are monopoly, duopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. These are the relevant market structures which are often linked to product differentiation and to economies of scale. And these are the designs, the market designs that we meet in most developing and developed countries nowadays. So if anyone has some doubts about what is monopoly, yes, what is monopolistic competition, and what is oligopoly, yes, of course, please have a look at the undergraduate textbooks of microeconomics or international economics. There you will find an answer. I will be explaining a little bit too, but I think I should not repeat what you have already learned in the last semesters. Economies of scale is something that has two effects. One effect is that it changes the impact of an industry in international trade, and it also can change the impact of an individual firm or of a group of firms. So economies of scale we generally meet in two different expressions, internal or external economies of scale. Internal economies of scale happen at the firm level. Yes, so the costs of a firm, they depend on the size of the firm. If you have a large company, yes, large companies with high fixed costs, they can really reduce their average and the marginal costs very much. That is why large firms have a real cost advantage, as we say. So large firms generally are price setters and you meet them in market structures that comply with the name imperfect competition. Economies of scale of the internal variety happen at the industry level. Industry output increases when the number of firms active in that industry increase. This you can take as being an expression of perfect competition. So most of those firms are, small or medium-sized firms, and they're price takers. They just adjust their quantity to the given price. Both economies of scale, internal and external, can cause trade. Can cause trade among countries with exactly the same technology and the same endowments, which is to say the same autarky prices. Let us move now to market structure and gains from trade. The interaction of relative country size and imperfect competition determines the direction of trade. There is the concept of Cournot rivalry. Cournot, a French economist. Assume the case of two countries, two factors, n firms. N could be 1, could be 2, could be 3. One good. There is a figure, number 8.1 of the prescribed reading in chapter 8 of the textbook Applied to International Trade. If you take a look at that figure, you have two linear response curves corresponding to two firms active in a duopoly. Yes, so there are only two firms in the market, no more. This figure shows the plane Q2 to Q1. Q2 is the quantity produced in the second country, and Q1 is the quantity of the good produced in the first country. Both firms choose their own production quantities simultaneously on the basis of their beliefs about the other firm's choices. At the equilibrium point, which is the Cournot equilibrium, both curves cross. How does this work? Well, this works in the following way. As I mentioned before, there are only two firms in this market, and they observe each other. And if one firm has to decide the quantity it wants to supply, the first thing it does is to try to guess what the other firm is doing. So if the first firm wants to maximize its profit, then it can do that, but only in a conditional way, based, yes, on the guess of the quantity that the other firm is going to supply. Each firm maximizes profit as a function of the rival's production level. Each firm's profit falls when new firms enter the market, which is why it has an incentive to introduce entry barriers. For example, differentiate the good, or have a patent on a certain version of the good. Do things to avoid new companies entering the market. So This is what happens in the duopoly. Now, assuming the demand for the product is much higher in the foreign country than in the home country, then after moving from autarky to trade, the home country company increases its production and exports the good even if autarky prices are the same in both countries. The foreign supplier continues to produce the same quantity as before trade, a quantity that is much lower than foreign demand. And that firm in the foreign country does not export. So only the firm in the home country caters to both markets. Yes, the home country market and a share of the foreign market. And the foreign company just produces a share of the production necessary to satisfy the foreign market. It does not export. Now, by making use of economies of scale, the producer in the home market is able to supply both the domestic and a share of the foreign market. Also, following economies of scale, of course, the producer is able to reduce its cost. And if you can reduce the cost, you can also reduce the price. If you reduce the price, then you're benefiting consumers in both countries, in the home country and in the foreign country. So how do the gains from trade happen? In the home country, exporters and consumers gain. In the foreign country, only consumers gain. Where are the losses? Where the foreign producer earns less profit than before trade because the price has dropped because of the economies of scale in the home country firm. And foreign production, we assume, has remained constant. Of course, if you take a look at the figure, you can see, and if you play around a little bit, you can just imagine that a micro adjustment dynamic might come into play, and so the foreign firm can also increase its production but generally by less than the quantity demanded by foreign consumers. So the picture does not change much. Well, only if the number of firms in both countries increases. If we move from the duopoly to an oligopoly or more. Yes, if we have free entry to the markets, then of course profit falls and possibly some of the firms are going to be unable to cover the fixed costs and have to exit the market. If this happens, the remaining firms, the incumbents, expand their production. And if the number of firms is still high enough, profits will be almost zero. And consumers will be the only ones to gain in both countries. So the welfare gain will be equal to consumer surplus. This model, of course, can be applied to a case including transport costs, segmented markets, in markets connected by arbitrage. Yes, but we're going to skip that. There are two very interesting forms of rivalry under imperfect competition. One of them we have already mentioned. It's the Cournot rivalry, right? The Cournot rivalry we saw has to do with setting quantities, not prices. Well, the Bertrand rivalry sets prices. However, we're dealing here with homogeneous good, yes? So a good that is not differentiated. And firms in both countries set a price and commit to supply any quantity at that price. So it is possible, scale economies, that a firm captures the entire market in both countries if it sells at the lowest price. However, we assume that competition drives the costs and profits down until only two firms, one in each country, produce at the same cost. Well, as mentioned a minute ago, Bertrand rivals set a price, while Cournot rivals set the quantity produced. If we move to a world where product differentiation is allowed, of course, both modes of rivalry will become closer, but this assumption we had here concerning Bertrand rivalry, homogeneous good, will be very much weakened so that we won't be in the Bertrand model anymore. We'll rather move to the Cournot model. Product differentiation. What has product differentiation to do with imperfect competition? Well, if there is a good that is homogeneous, yes. For example, imagine there was only one car in the whole world, yes, and the car looked the same. It doesn't matter if it is produced in the United States, in Japan, in Europe, in South Africa, in Korea. Yes, it looked exactly the same. Then there would be a huge incentive, yes, for one or two companies to produce them all. If we introduce product differentiation, this offers opportunities for many firms to come and supply cars that look different, responding to what consumers really want. And if consumers, for example, in South Africa want a certain car with certain characteristics, and consumers in South Korea, yes, they want countries that are different, yes, and consumers in Brazil, yes, they also need cars that are different, that differ from the cars demanded in South Africa and differ from the cars demanded in South Korea. Yes, then we have three different consumer preferences, and this is enough to produce three kinds of cars. So product differentiation creates kind of monopolies for individual firms. And it is possible that if we stay with this example of the three countries, yes, that in South Africa you have maybe 60% of the consumers that prefer a certain kind of car, but 40% they also would like to drive a car made in Brazil or a car made in South Korea. Yes. So we would have scope, yes, for producing and exporting. If we do that, what are we doing? We don't have inter-industry exports, we have intra-industry exports. We are exporting and importing goods, differentiated goods from the same industry. Yes? So we are exporting cars and we are importing cars. Why? Because consumers have their tastes. Yes? So this is what happens in a world where product differentiation is allowed. You build small monopolies for the companies involved. So that is why in economic and international trade theory, we have had researchers that dedicated their research time to develop models with varieties of a good. And you can differentiate a good in different ways. You can have a vertically differentiated good, and you can also have a horizontally differentiated good. A good is vertically differentiated if consumers prefer one variety to the other. So you have two varieties, but consumers focus just on one, even if both are sold at the same price. The varieties can be horizontally differentiated when some consumers prefer the first and the others the second variety, even in the case that both are sold at the same price. So if varieties are horizontally differentiated and consumers have a preference for variety, you will see in many papers, if you're interested in this topic, the name is Love of Variety. Consumers' utility is higher when total consumption of a good is spread over several varieties of the good. This is the characteristic. So international trade follows not from different technologies, not from different endowments. It just follows from the consumer's desire for a wider assortment of varieties than the domestic suppliers can produce. What are the effects of a tariff when a foreign oligopoly serves the home market? There is no competition by home-based firms. The home market is segmented, which means that foreign firms maximize their profits independently of local firms. There is no contact. Well, in figure 10.1 in the prescribed reading, you can see in the price quantity plane what happens when ad valorem tariff tau is imposed. We have a demand curve, we have the perceived marginal revenue. And so if a tariff is introduced, of course, the imports fall. Imports in this case are foreign exports. So imports fall. And the consumer surplus in the home country also falls. Why? Because consumers have to pay more for the same good. So the gains in welfare include foreign exporter surplus, which can be offset by losses in consumer surplus following the price increase in the home country. Thus, foreign exporters capture much of the changes in welfare, and please note that this result differs from the one under perfect competition. Now what happens if a home country, not a foreign, a home country oligopoly serves a segmented foreign market where it does not face any competition? And assume the home country levies an export tax, and the symbol is called theta. The story is represented in figure 10.2 of the prescribed reading, showing the effect of an ad valorem export tax. The export tax, of course, does reduce exports, and thus the exporters profit. However, the foreign consumers' surplus is transferred to home countries' exporters. The tax revenue also accrues to the home country, the welfare of which increases by the area V, capital U, capital Z. Thus again, in these cases, you can see that an oligopoly can make trade happen and can increase welfare too. What do we conclude from imperfect competition? Intuitions gained from the analysis of perfectly competitive settings are misleading when applied to oligopolistic environments. When markets are oligopolistic, countries may trade with partners with whom they share the same technology and factor costs. Direction of trade and welfare effects depend on the relative size of the countries and particularly on the structure of national industry. This is the market structure and the existence of scale economies. Welfare gains may happen even when no actual trade takes place. Just by reducing the monopoly power, yes, by removing entry barriers, generates the gains because increased competition immediately brings prices closer to marginal costs, and of course benefits consumers. Empirical estimates of imperfect competition hypotheses are very successful. The effect of market power on trade or of trade on market power can be assessed empirically very well. And predictions from the models, some of them we have discussed and others you have in the book, are generally supported by the data. Please note, in the case of perfect competition, we did not have such a good empirical feedback. So empirical analysis of trade and trade policy and imperfect competition offer large opportunities to researchers. And the greatly improved availability of databases at the firm and at the product levels have enabled researchers to take a much closer look at the trade among different groups of countries. Thank you very much for your attention.